The Five Eyes is a vastly powerful spy group made up of the United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. It has an impressive history, from helping to defeat communism to fending off Al-Qaeda. And with growing incidents of terrorism and threats from China, Russia, and Iran, the need for deep intelligence only the Five Eyes can offer is clear. Last week, I spoke with writer Richard Kerbaj, who specialized in national security-related stories and is the author of The Secret History of the Five Eyes. Thank you so much for joining us, Richard. Always interesting to hear about intrigue and espionage. We throw the term Five Eyes around a lot when we're talking about intelligence and reporting on it in Canada. But can you lay out for us what exactly is the Five Eyes, or who are the Five Eyes, and what do they do?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your program. The Five Eyes was essentially an alliance that was created very much in self-interest by the UK and US in 1956, and it was very much created in response to the Soviet threat during the early days of the Cold War. But its embryonic stages date back to even the interwar years, pre-war. And if you look at the central role that Canada played, because it did play a central role in those embryonic years, you look at the training that the Canadians provided, for instance, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the forerunner agency to the CIA. They provided training at Camp X in Ontario, taught them how to break into enemy lines, how to survive interrogation under pressure, how to carry out sabotage operations. The Canadians were the first to join the circle of trust because the UK and USA created this pact after the Second World War to kind of formalize the intelligence sharing. And it was very much them to begin with. And then the Canadians joined in 1949 before the UK-USA agreement was expanded to become the Five Eyes in 1956.
Such a complex environment that's being operated in now, with the resurgence of ISIS and terrorist groups, with concerns about the far right, mis and disinformation, as you said, Russia as well, Iran, and intimately familiar here in Canada with issues around transnational repression and foreign interference, which we've had a major report on early in 2025. When you look at Canada's contribution, I know we get a lot out of the Five Eyes because there have been terror attacks, plots that were thwarted here as a result from tips from Americans. But there's also been a lot of concern about whether Canada is contributing a sufficient amount or kind of just mooching and sponging off of this. How do you see Canada's contribution now?
Well, the US contributes roughly about $100 billion a year to intelligence, just to its own intelligence community. And that's about 10 times greater than all the other Four Eyes combined. Now, that's only a single metric, but as much as money can buy you satellites and submarines and surveillance, it doesn't guarantee you security. What guarantees you security is access, and access to great information, great judgment, great analysis. And that really does come from individuals, either in the field or analysts or people, assessment staff, and Canada has contributed greatly in that area, not just because of its geography and its proximity and its capability to sort of reach the Arctic and have a good ear into Eastern Russia, or a capability across Latin America, but also because of its judgment. Now, we've seen those political judgments and the intelligence judgments play out probably most powerfully in the lead up to the Iraq invasion. You remember they had the intelligence, they said, of weapons of mass destruction. And it took you Prime Minister at the time to avoid making the mistake that other countries made. So from that perspective, I think Canada did contribute to the Canadians especially, but also to some lessons learned within the Five Eyes about the mistakes that were made.
Donald Trump has talked about potentially pulling out of NATO. He's talked about pulling out of a number of alliances, obviously taking a much more confrontational approach with a number of allies. He's been particularly frustrated with Canada's defense contribution. He hasn't spoken, I don't think, specifically about intelligence, but it does make me wonder, do you think that the Five Eyes could be in his targeting system as he's looking around for things that he could threaten or pull out of? And what sort of consequences would that have for global security?
If you look at the sort of the campaign promise that he made, and we were to take him at his word, he says that he wants to achieve peace through strength. Now, I can't see any other intelligence alliance that has what the Five Eyes has, that has the reach and the power and the capability and the analytical judgment and the operational sort of values and standards that the Five Eyes has. So if he wants peace through strength, you'd want to preserve the Five Eyes. And you were right earlier in saying that he hasn't yet mentioned the Five Eyes, and hopefully he'll steer clear of the Five Eyes. But even if he were, for instance, to undermine an intelligence community, if that ever happened, we have seen this, historically, but certainly in his first term, we've seen Five Eyes intelligence officials gather together and not withhold information from each other, but continue the information sharing and protect each other, because you might have the political misalignment. And also, the point to make about the Five Eyes is that it's been around for a long time now, 6 decades, 7 decades, 8 decades, depends how far you want to trace back its roots. But it's survived every single administration and government that it's served. And I like to think that, regardless of what it's hit by, it'll continue to do so.
Canada, I think, thought that we'd survived a lot of things under previous American administrations that we are now suddenly finding ourselves subject to. Do you think that there's a scenario where if America did withdraw, that the Four Eyes, as it were, would continue to function, or would that just break apart?
That's a very good question, and there's a historical example that I can cite here. Because in the mid-1980s, the New Zealanders fell out with the Americans because the New Zealand Prime Minister of the day refused to allow a US nuclear-powered submarine to dock in Wellington. And the Reagan administration was incensed. They couldn't understand why the New Zealanders would stand up to them. So they wanted to announce publicly that they are cutting their ties with New Zealand. And very quickly, the head of the NSA at the time, the National Security Agency, the signals agency in the US, appealed to the Reagan administration saying, so we can't do this because we've got so many joint operations and we rely on them geographically. There are joint intelligence operations going on every day at a signals level and also at a human level. You got joint agent running operations. You've got joint counterterrorism operations. People are in each other's offices. I just cannot see that happening. But if it does, I'll definitely do a very quick update on the book.
Well, certainly, perhaps some very welcome reassurance there in terms of the future of that important intelligence sharing arrangement. Richard, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to have you back soon.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Now for one last thing. It started with what Canadian politicians insisted was just a joke: Canada as the 51st state. Even incoming Trump administration officials who I spoke to on background assured me the president-elect wasn't serious. But now that assessment is changing. On Friday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau told an emergency economic summit that he held Trump is serious about Canada becoming a state. That view is backed by someone very controversial who is also very close to Donald Trump and knows his ideology: Steve Bannon, a former top Trump aide. In an interview with Global News, Bannon said that this is not about fentanyl, tariffs, or trade. It's about hemispheric control and Trump's vision of U.S. grand strategy and geopolitics.
Canada's greatest defense is about to become your softest underbelly. China and Russia, the great powers, and the United States, fighting it out over the Arctic is going to be the new great game of the 21st century. Canada, you are thrust into the middle of that, and quite frankly, you are the greatest, I don't know if target or prize.
Bannon says Trump is trying to create a north-south economic and military corridor. Certainly some critical context to consider as Canada works on a strategy to deal with the American president.